Continuing now with this discussion, Carlos Yordan is an associate professor of political science and director of Middle East Studies program at Drew University. He's here now to talk about the conflict in Syria. Welcome, good to have you here.
Yeah, thank you for having me.
Well, what do we need to know really about what is going on in Syria?
What you need to know is that the situation is actually getting worse for the people of Syria, and it's probably turning a little bit better for the government and for the regime.
Well, we've seen these regime changes and the Arab awakenings. We look at Egypt, Libya, Yemen. We've seen death. We've seen trials. We've seen exiles in exchange for immunity. What could Assad's fate be?
Unfortunately, the situation in Syria is one that it will not probably be what we saw in Libya anytime soon. It all depends on the international community if there's will to intervene. The Assad regime seems to have been able to weaken the internal armed opposition. There's still a very strong political opposition, but at least the armed one seems to be at the end of its fighting right now.
Well, President Obama met with the Turkish Prime Minister over the weekend. The two have come to an agreement, and it's a non-violent agreement. Can you talk about the significance here?
It's important. The United States is finally putting some weight into the conflict. What we're giving the rebels, I guess, will be medical as well as humanitarian assistance, but we're also going to give them telecommunications equipment. And that's important, because you're going to see is that you're going to have people having satellite phones and other devices that would allow them to coordinate actions against the Syrian government.
Can the U.S. legally arm the rebels?
Legally, yes. There is no resolution right now from the Security Council stating that we should not arm them. We can do so, but it definitely has some problems.
What about the UN? Do they have the power, and would it make sense for them to get involved?
The United Nations has the power only if China and Russia were to agree on a mission and the other members of the Security Council.
All right, and what about NATO? What are their options should Assad continue to attack his own people?
NATO will only act if the Security Council is to give them legal authority, and at this moment in time, that's not going to happen.
What other countries have interest in Syria?
A lot of countries, actually. Iran has a very strong interest in Syria. They're very strong allies. Saudi Arabia is now putting more pressure on the Syrian government, and they have decided that they're going to start arming the opposition. Qatar, a small country, but diplomatically very influential, has at the same time said that they're willing to supply arms to the opposition. And Kuwait, even though the government has not taken that position, the parliament has taken the same position.
Are the Arab nations united in their stand?
They're united in the sense that they want to help the Sunni majority topple the regime, but they don't have a plan of action at this moment in time. Egypt, for instance, has a lot of internal difficulties, so they're not really looking at the outside world. Saudi Arabia is really more of the Gulf countries that have a very strong position here. And
like we've touched on, we've seen all of these regime change in these Arab awakenings before, and we just don't know which path it's going to take.
Absolutely.
Could it get a lot worse, people are assuming, before it gets better?
Unfortunately, it will probably have to get worse before it gets better. If the idea is to topple the regime right now is in a position of power. We know from news reports that the opposition doesn't have as many arms left, and they're running out of ammunition, so they need to be replenished. All
right, let me really put it out there. Does this end with Assad's death?
Difficult to say. I mean, we do know that the opposition is very big. Assad, of course, will be vulnerable as a person, but at this moment in time, it's difficult to say.
Well, what about the United States? Should the United States consider invading Syria?
No, I don't think we can do that at this moment in time, at least. We are trying to get out of Afghanistan. Iraq, of course, is a big problem for us, even though we have left. And we have an election year. I don't think it's going to happen right now.
You just have so many people fleeing the country, so much internal conflict going on. And again, so much of the world is watching, and they're just not sure with all of this unrest what is going to happen. It's hard to make predictions here.
Very difficult. And this, I did my PhD on the Bosnian situation. So this looks a lot like Bosnia in 92-93, where the international community wanted to end the conflict, but it couldn't. And then the internal forces just led to more violence and more bloodshed.
You have Assad saying, listen, I'm fighting terrorists here.
Right.
How legitimate is that? Not
very legitimate, but it does sell very well to the Syrian people. The Syrian regime, as you probably know, it's a very diverse country. The Alawites control the controls of power, but you do have Christians and other sects that are not Sunni that are very afraid of Sunnis taking power. And there's a lot of Sunni groups, Islamist, militant Islamists, that are part of the opposition. So there is some reality to that, but it's not really Al-Qaeda or other forces like that.
We had talked a little bit about how President Obama had reached out with the Turkish Prime Minister. Right. This alliance, this agreement here, how significant is this? How does this impact it and perhaps change the dynamics?
I think it can change the dynamics if the Turkish government is willing to open a humanitarian corridor. That's to say, you can create a special area in the northern part of Syria, next to the Turkish border, where you can not only put humanitarian aid, but you can put armaments. You can create corridors to arm the opposition. And if that happens, then it may be able to turn the tide against the Assad regime. But right now, that's kind of difficult.
A lot of unrest, a lot of unknowns. Carlos Yordan, thank you so much for taking the time to talk to us.